In defining civilization, African civilization in this talk, I guess I'm siding oddly with some of the Afrocentrists in the academy because the concept of African civilization is widely disputed among anthropologists, of course, as we would expect, who find nothing but complexity and impossible difference. But I do believe that the patterns of African politics, of course, is what Aristotle called the master science. The patterns of African politics are so similar and so contrastive with the rest of the world that it does reflect some common civilization that seems to shape the contemporary existence of life in, yes, sub-Saharan Africa. I'm excluding North Africa from this. And I'm going to make 4 points. First of all, I'll make the point that African civilization is the most diametrically opposite to Western civilization of any civilization you can find, and therefore, as a learning tool, it's very useful to study African civilization. Secondly, and this somewhat makes it difficult, is the difference lies not just in the fundamental assumptions, but in the developmental gap. So the problem with studying African civilization is there is no such thing as a modernized African civilization. And therefore, we're studying really African civilization in a pre-modern phase because of its low developmental levels in Africa, and trying to compare that to what a idealized modernized African civilization would look like if it existed, and it doesn't exist right now. That's the problem. So trying to compare it one-on-one is difficult. I'll talk about the Colonial Encounter because I do think the Colonial Encounter was massively important, not so much in what it changed, but more what it didn't change, how it failed because it was terminated prematurely, and the consequences of that which we're living with today in modern Africa. Okay, so let me back up a little. A well-known essay of 1991, the Cameroonian economist Daniel Etunga Manguel argued, the main features of African civilization were as follows. First, a high degree of fatalism, irrationalism, and belief in magic. Secondly, a communitarianism that suffocated individual initiative. Third, an overwhelming focus on the past and the present and not on the future. Fourthly, a disregard for rational economic planning. And fifthly, an excessive concentration of authority and power in a single individual, the so-called big man ruler, who often claims to have magical powers. Those 5 dimensions of African civilization, it turns out, map very nicely as opposites to the 5 dimensions that the French philosopher Philippe Nemo famously argued were the key dimensions of Western civilization, namely Greek ideals of individual liberty, reason, and science, Roman ideals of law and humanism, the Judeo-Christian biblical notions of ethics and progress against evil, the papal call to action and responsibility during the medieval period, and finally Enlightenment notions of pluralism and democracy. That's what how Nemo defined Western civilization. So in effect, we have in African civilization a perfect mirror of Western civilization. The irrationalism, what Etunga Manguel defined as the irrationalism of African civilization, contrasts with Greek reason. The communitarianism of African civilization contrasts with Roman humanism. The focus on the past and the present contrasts with the biblical belief in progress and the future. The disregard for economic realities contrasts with the papal call for action and responsibility. And finally, the concentration of authority in the big man ruler contrasts with the Enlightenment ideal of pluralism and liberal democracy. Keep in mind, I haven't defined this as better or worse, simply as different. But the fact that Europe conquered Africa rather than the other way around suggests that Europe's developmental advances created a civilization that was able to win out over others, if only in terms of coercion. The post-colonial record in Africa has been one essentially in which this African civilization has come back to life, often with a vengeance. And this is why Etunga Manguel's 1991 essay was actually called, Does Africa Need a Cultural Adjustment Program? This was, of course, a play on the IMF Structural Adjustment Program. And Etunga Manguel was making the point that any number of institutional innovations will not take shape unless there are underlying cultural innovations that need to take place. The dilemma was not how to westernize Africa. For Etunga Manguel, the dilemma was how to modernize Africa. We know that Asia, for example, has made striking advances without a strong commitment to individual liberty, humanism, pluralism, or democracy. Presumably, Africa could also make striking advances without replicating Western civilization. The question for Etunga Manguel was how to modernize it. And where are Africa's modernizers? Where are its Park Chung-hees? Where are its Deng Xiaopings? Where are its Lee Kuan Yews? So I'll turn secondly to the question of another well-known essay, written in 1975 by the Nigerian sociologist Peter Eke. It was called Colonialism and the Two Publics in Africa, and in it, Eke noted that post-colonial Africa was characterized by a disconnect between, let's call it the culture or the civilization of the private sphere and the culture or the civilization of the public sphere. Now, those kind of disconnects between the public and the private are not unique to Africa. Edward Banfield's famous book, The Moral Basis of a Backward Society, was actually about a southern Italian village. Similar studies of communist systems. And what they found was you had a high-minded public space, a high-minded public sphere, and then a dog-eat-dog, immoral, uncivil private sphere. What Eke argued was unique about Africa was not the separation, but the fact that the moral sphere was the private sphere, and the immoral sphere was the public sphere. For Eke, what had happened in Africa as a result of the struggle against colonialism was a perception of the public space as the place of immoral, the place to be attacked, looted, robbed, and the private realm where one had face-to-face embedded relationships with others is where moral and ethical behavior took shape. We can look at someone like Jacob Zuma and be just astounded that Africa's most developed country could not just elect him, but re-elect him, despite widespread graft, corruption, multiple charges on multiple counts, and a truly gargantuan ability to loot the South African treasury with impunity. He's very emblematic of the notion that African civilization, to the extent that it exists anywhere, exists only in the private realm. And the public realm has, in some ways, been absent of that. Here's when I want to bring in the role of colonialism, because the challenge for Africa therefore becomes three-part. First of all, if this underlying civilization that Otenga Menguel identified is not modernized, characterized by widespread belief in magic, of course, which is widespread in many pre-modern societies, the question was how to modernize African civilization. Then there's a second challenge. Now you need to shift that modernized African civilization into the public space, because the public space is absent of culture and civilization. And then thirdly, you needed to somehow conjure out of nowhere the material prerequisites that have always been associated with these kinds of transformations. Development matters. It's a hard truth, but development matters for these kind of cultural and civilizational transformations. So this is the challenge of Africa. You know, striking a budget deal in Washington doesn't look very difficult after I tell you about what Africa's challenges are. It's threefold: modernize its civilization, spread that civilization into the public space, and somehow develop the material prerequisites for this sort of transformation. This is where I want to bring in the role of colonialism. Eke, as I mentioned, argued that the origins of the disconnect between the public and private spheres in Africa was national resistance to the colonial state. It portrayed the colonial public sphere as the enemy of African civilization, and the challenge was therefore to tear down the public space, and African civilization would flourish. The problem, of course, was the ordinary African, as Eke wrote, took these principles of resistance far too seriously, so that after independence, the public space continued to be the space not where African civilization emerged, but where a failure of civilization continued to dominate politics. Leaders like Yoweri Museveni, who seized power in Uganda in 1986 with much promise of reform, have slowly colonized the public sphere with this anti-ethical, kind of amoral public approach. And the real challenge, therefore, is perhaps not so much the idea that colonialism was a source of resistance and that the resistance to the colonial state caused the public space to be a shambles. This was Eke's argument. It might be something deeper. It might be the fact that even when authentic African states came into being, the culture or the civilization that populated the public space, if they did that, was a culture or civilization that was not modernized, that had those prerequisites that Otenga Menguel talked about: pervasive belief in magic, focus on the past and the present rather than the future, a belief in the concentration of authority in a big man ruler. Africa, as you may know, is the home to 15 of the 20 longest serving dictators in the world. 36 years, I think, is the current record, and still going strong. So for someone like Goran Haydn, who's a famous Africanist at the University of Florida, the reason that African politics had become so dysfunctional was not so much that it had become amoral, that there was this separation between the public and private. It was actually precisely that the private had colonized the public, and the private was a pre-modern civilization unsuited to modern conditions. Colonialism was a kind of accelerated attempt to not only modernize African civilization, but to civilize the public sphere. And when you look back at the writings of people like Chinua Achebe, the great Nigerian novelist, writing at the time and shortly after the time, their enthusiasm about the colonial experience is very tangible. Here's a quote from Achebe, born in 1930 in colonial Nigeria. "I grew up at a time when the colonial educational infrastructure celebrated hard work and high achievement, and so did the families and communities. As a young man, surrounded by all this excitement, it seemed as if the British were planning surprises for me at every turn, including the construction of a new university." Achebe calls his generation very lucky and extraordinarily lucky. Another quote, "The pace of change in Nigeria from the 1940s onwards was incredible. I'm not just talking about the rate of development, with villages transforming into towns, or the coming of modern comforts such as electricity or running water, or modes of transportation, but more of a sense that we were standing figuratively and literally at the dawn of a new era." So the colonial era was this moment where things were coming together for African civilization. African civilization was modernizing, development was taking place, and there was at least the beginnings of a public space in which norms of conduct, perhaps particularly African norms of conduct, but nonetheless norms of conduct that could create a public space, were starting to take hold. And it was really in this context that African civilization and consciousness emerged. Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart, probably the only decent novel ever written in modern Africa, and that's according to The Guardian, by the way, which is hardly a, Eurocentric, chauvinistic kind of magazine, newspaper. Things Fall Apart was entirely dependent upon the good offices of British colonialism to be published. British publishers, British editors, and Achebe is particularly fond of the contribution to the British Postal Service in getting his manuscript back and forth to London. And by the time Achebe died, his hopes that there would be an Igbo translation, Igbo is his native language, had come to naught because the Igbos were not interested in great literature, right? Such as Things Fall Apart. So this was the sort of tragedy of the end of colonialism, and the tragedy of the end of Africa's encounter with a modernizing experience that might have brought about that triple transformation I talked about. Rapid development, a modernizing of African culture and civilization, and a colonization, let's call it, of Africa's public sphere by this modernized culture and civilization. All three of those things fell apart immediately, within months of the end of colonialism. The collapse of the state in Africa in the period after decolonization is astounding in its rapidity. In 1996, the World Bank concluded that almost every African country had less state capacity in 1996 than it had at the time of colonialism. And that's not just a political sciencey kind of thing. That means tens of thousands of people died, because state capacity is closely associated with service delivery, in particular in public health. So where does this leave us all in thinking about African culture and civilization? Well, if the Western tradition is anything, it's universally accessible and deployable. And I think the Western tradition is universally accessible and deployable by African intellectuals seeking to modernize Africa. And I think at some point we will see the emergence of African civilization that is both developed and modern and is actually exerting institutional checks on the public sphere so that the public sphere is indeed for the public good. My guess is if this is going to emerge anywhere, it'll be in Ghana. Ghana is, of course, the former British Gold Coast. It's one of the most developed countries in Africa. It's really the only truly democratic country in Africa of any size at this point. And it's a place where West African culture is very rich, of course, because this was a wealthy part of Africa. And it's a place where you can see perhaps the beginnings of modern African civilization emerging. But countries like Ghana are prone to sudden collapse and reversal. Look at Liberia, which just elected a former football player, soccer star, as its president. Okay, that's not such a big deal. We've elected, movie stars and whatnot. His running mate, the vice president of Liberia, is the wife of Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor, you may have heard, the most grossly incompetent and tyrannical and brutal regime leader in Liberia in the 1990s, who single-handedly led a civil war. And their program, as far as we can tell, because the football star doesn't know much about policy, so she's the kind of policy person, is to bring back Charles Taylor's policies to Liberia. Right? This is after a decade of relatively successful rule in Liberia under Alan Sirleaf Johnson. So the news is not good. All I can say is we need more civilizations. The world is better. Western civilization is better when there are flourishing civilizations, as we're seeing in East Asia during the Winter Olympics, right? East Asian civilization is doing very fine in its distinctive ways in bringing basic decency and flourishing to human beings. I think we could have something coming out of Africa. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which started in the African context and have now been used widely in conflict resolution processes around the world, are a truly African contribution to world civilization and human flourishing. Here's a quote from Sir Alan Burns, who I happen to be writing a biography about. He was the governor of the Gold Coast in the late 40s. He says, "There's no reason why in the future, if they are given a fair chance economically and socially, Africans should not advance in civilization and culture and contribute their undoubted qualities to a world which was not yet reached perfection under Western domination." So I will close with that. Thank you.